This interview is being conducted with Richard King on the campus of Abilene Christian University on March the 6th, 1996. The interviewer is Dr. Vernon L. Williams of the Department of History at Abilene Christian. Mr. King, if you would, give us a little background of your family life, where you grew up and who your parents were, and a little bit about what you were doing as a school boy and in the 1920s and 30s.
Very well. I was born in Des Moines, Iowa. My parents were Iowa farm people. My father came from Algona, Iowa, and his name was Fred Menzo King, and my mother was Edith McLaury, and she grew up in Webster City, Iowa. Both these towns are a little ways north of Des Moines. I was born, as I said, in Des Moines in 1912, and shortly thereafter the family moved to St. Louis, Missouri, where I started elementary school in Webster Groves, which is a suburb of St. Louis. We stayed in St. Louis up until 1925, when we moved to Kewanee, Illinois, where my father set up his own hardware business. He'd been in the hardware business all his life, and he always wanted his own store. And so in 25 he realized that ambition, but of course this turned out to be an unfortunate time in spite of what all his friends told him. And when the Depression came along, hard times really set in, and he finally had to close down the store. In the meantime, I was finishing grade school in Kewanee, Illinois, and going to high school there. During those years, I had become acquainted with people who were radio amateurs, and so I got interested myself in the radio business. And in 1928, I would say, I got my first radio license, signed by Herbert Hoover, Secretary of Commerce. And so I had my own little radio station and communicated with other radio amateurs. This was all by radio telegraphy. In those days, radio telephony was too expensive for the ordinary kid. It just took too much gear. So we contented ourselves with dots and dashes. So that activity took me pretty well through high school. One thing I did in high school, which had some connection with my military career later, was that during my junior and senior years, I took a month each of those years in what was called then the Citizens Military Training Camps, CMTC. The Army wanted young trainees in those days and didn't have any money, so they asked high school students to come for a month, paid them railroad fare only, no salary, just all you could eat, and you were a buck private in the rear rank for a month. I did that for 2 summers, as I said. Then in 1930, I went to the University of Illinois, enrolled in the electrical engineering department, and took ROTC, and was automatically, of course, assigned to the Signal Corps ROTC, and graduated from the University of Illinois in 1934, commissioned a second lieutenant in Signal Corps. It was my intention at that time to return to the law school. In fact, I enrolled in the fall of 1934 in the law school at the University of Illinois. I had gone through undergraduate school on a scholarship, a loan scholarship of $400 a year, which together with a meal job was enough in those days. But when I could not get the scholarship extended, and when I came back in the fall of 1934, I had the meal job, and that was, well, I had $5 too, but about 6 weeks later I was broke, and I had to leave school. So I got a job as a radio operator. I had been a radio operator, not only an amateur operator, which I mentioned previously, but during my college summers, I had worked on ships on the Great Lakes. And so I had a commercial license as well as an amateur license. And when I couldn't get any kind of I was at loose ends after getting out of the law school, broke, and thought that I could save some money by going to sea and then come back to law school, which I did. I went to sea, I did that part, and saved some money, and got my credits transferred to Columbia University, but I never followed through because I decided after a year and a half of going to sea that I had better try to get a job ashore. And I had friends at Schenectady, New York, who had been urging me all this period to come up to Schenectady. So I got an interview in the spring of 1937 and went up to Schenectady and had a lovely interview. It turned out that the recruiter had numerous people lined up to come aboard General Electric Company in the summer of 1937, but business was getting greatly better, and he was in a bind for people in April when I came along. Therefore, the first question he asked me in my interview was, "Dick, when could you come to work?" So I came to work in the General Electric Company in April of 1937 and stayed in Schenectady on the test engineering course until 1940, when I was assigned a job in our Chicago office. I no sooner got to our Chicago office than I got the letter a few months later from the War Department telling me that I was ordered into the service at Fort Lewis, Washington, the 3rd Infantry Division Signal Company. So in April of 1941, I got in my little Ford V8 60 coupe and drove from Chicago to Fort Lewis, Washington. And that began my military career of during World War II.
What about rank? How did you enter the service?
I had done correspondence courses, and I had done some summer camps, so that I had become a first lieutenant by the time I was ordered in.
So were you carrying a reserve commission up to that point?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Well, what happens next?
Well, when I arrived at the 3rd Infantry Division Signal Company, there were 2 other officers there. You have to remember, the background is that in those days, there were only 2 Army divisions active, full Army divisions, only the 1st and the 3rd, that's all there was. And even in the 3rd, in the signal company, the only officers were the lieutenant colonel, the signal officer, and 1 other lieutenant. So when I came upon the scene, lo and behold, each of the lieutenants got half the jobs in the signal company, and the roster of the lieutenants that you should have for the various sections goes on and on. You know, you should have a motorman and a mess officer, and you should have a radio officer and a telephone officer and a teletype officer, and I can't remember how many, but we divided those jobs. We had, the 2 of us had the whole thing. And not only that, but immediately upon my arrival, the division was ordered to some maneuvers on the Hearst Ranch at the center of California near King City. And these maneuvers involved a motor march from Fort Lewis, Washington to the Hearst Ranch, and that motor march was the first long motor march ever made by the United States Army, certainly in division size, and so it was a testing of equipment and required shuttling of the men because there was not enough truck equipment to handle the whole division all in one shot. So we had to take part of the men part way and then go back and get another part and so on. But anyway, the march concluded successfully, at least successfully in terms of that everybody got there. And then we had a maneuver for about a month on the Hearst Ranch, which involved problems for the command of the different units. At this stage, I don't remember whether we actually had opposing units or whether the opposing units were phantom units. But at any rate, the commanders were given some assumptions of the kind of opposition that they were meeting, and they were required to decide what courses of action they should take to meet these theoretical forces. And this maneuver continued for some time, and of course the signal people had an important part in it. And one of the things that we learned then was the importance of rapid telephone communication. One of my jobs was as wire officer, so it was up to me to get the wire network installed to the subordinate commands. And at that time we found how important it was to do that rapidly. And in order to do that rapidly, we decided that we would have not just one wire team starting from headquarters and going to a regiment, but we would have a wire team at headquarters and a wire team at regiment, and have them both start laying wire together and join to cut the time required in half. Now, this might sound as though it would be hard under those conditions to find out where these men were going to meet with their wire, but that's not as hard as it sounds, because the zone of action of each regiment was fairly narrow, and the teams quickly could determine about where the other team would be coming and could send out a jeep to meet them and make those arrangements. And that resulted in rapid establishment of telephone communication to the next lower unit. After those maneuvers, we went back to Fort Lewis, Washington for a brief stay, and then had another maneuver on the Olympic Peninsula, in the forest on the Olympic Peninsula. That one assumed a Japanese landing on the coast, and we were supposed to be repelling that. And about all I can remember of that maneuver is that that operations in a thick forest are really, really difficult, very, very difficult to move the troops and set up the communications and just do anything. So whether or not that maneuver was considered successful or not successful, I don't know, but we got out of that with a whole skin too. And at about that moment, I got a telegram, a War Department order, that said that I was relieved of assignment from the 3rd Infantry Division Signal Company and assigned to the Communication Department, Armored Force School, Fort Knox, Kentucky. Well, this was highly unusual. I knew nothing about it in advance, and certainly nobody in the 3rd Infantry Division knew anything about it. And so we were all mystified as to how this came about. Later, I might as well say how it came about now. Later we found out that General Chaffee, who set up the armored force, had been given almost carte blanche to commandeer whatever people he needed from whatever places, and that his representatives had gone through the Corps area headquarters looking for people with a radio background and had hit my record and had requisitioned me, so to speak, sight unseen and unknown, except that my record included some radio experience. So that was how I got assigned to the Armored Force School. The Armored Force School had the mission of teaching radio operators for long-distance transmission, and the maintenance and repair of all of the radio equipment of an armored division. Now, to differentiate between long and short distance, the tanks, the actual operation of the tanks, was controlled by short range, frequency modulated transmitters and receivers, which were mounted in the tanks. And the tank commanders could speak back and forth within their platoon, or they could call their company commander. For higher headquarters, from combat command up to division, and for division up to corps, sometimes a radio that would cover a larger distance was required. And this meant that radio telegraphy probably had to be used, because voice communication over such distances was not reliable. Consequently, the school had to teach radio operators skilled in radio telegraphy, as well as another course of students taking radio repair, maintenance and repair. Now, the radio operating school the course lasted about 14 weeks. And we had 2 classes going simultaneously, or 2 shifts going. We had the first shift starting at 5 in the morning and running until noon, and the second shift starting at noon and running till 7. Half the time those men spent at the code table learning da-da-da-da. And then the other half of their time was in class learning the various other skills that a radio man riding in a half-track vehicle needed to know. Something about vehicle maintenance, something about a little bit about radio maintenance, something about codes and ciphers, certainly something about map reading, and then the other skills of driving and vehicle handling and other military skills. So that at the end of 14 weeks, these people could handle 12 words a minute in code. They could operate in the vehicle, because for the last several weeks of their course, they were in fact operating on roads in vehicles under as near to simulated combat conditions as we could dream up, which meant that we had several convoys of half-tracks with, say, 10 cars in each convoy, and each car in the convoy had to communicate with his corresponding car in other convoys and exchange traffic all the time that they were beating up and down the roads all around Fort Knox, Kentucky. So I was in that job as an instructor, and finally as in charge of the radio operators division, and made captain while I was instructing, and then made major, I guess, while I was in charge of the division. The procedure there was that as an officer became senior in the department, and as the requirements for new divisions came along, the senior officer in the department then was nominated to be signal officer of the next division formed. And consequently, I became senior in the department at about the time the 20th Division was formed. And my first orders were to the 20th Armored Division after conclusion of a school at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, a signal school for a month or two for advanced, for field grade officers. Well, the orders got changed a good many times between the 20th Division and the 8th Division, and it finally came to rest that I was going to be part of the cadre for the 16th Armored Division to be formed at Fort Smith, Arkansas. So I traveled to Fort Smith, Arkansas, and found that all of the staff officers of the division were required to go to a new divisions course at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, Command and General Staff School. So we met our new general there, General Douglas Green, and all the other members of the staff, and the commanding officers of the various units were at the new division's course. So after this short course, it was only 3 or 4 weeks at the most, we activated the 16th Armored Division at Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, which is outside Fort Smith. And I trained with that division. And we had all the standard things to learn. We had to teach all the basics to every rating, every kind of rating we had. Drivers, radio operators, code cryptographers, teletype operators, switchboard operators, the whole gamut. And that training proceeded practically day and night. In the meantime, the officers all were assigned to specialty schools connected with their specialty, someplace or other. And as the senior officer, I was assigned a longer course at the Command and General Staff School, Fort Leavenworth. It was a requirement that every staff officer complete that course satisfactorily before he could go overseas with his division. And so that was a real testing period, because it was a tough course. It was 14 weeks, as I recall, and in class every day, all day, full schedule, and a homework assignment every night, and a tough proposition, but we got through that. How are we getting along?
Pretty good. I wanted to ask you one question.
Yeah.
While we're still with the 16th, uh, are you aware, in terms of the maintenance battalion, was there any connection with private business like the 134th later and the 12th Armored Division was tied to the International Harvester Company? Are you aware of any connection of private business supplying those that personnel?
No, I'm not. It may well have been, but I just didn't know it. I remember, though, that the 134th was a harvester battalion. And it may have been that, I don't remember what that battalion was at the 16th, but that may have been a company battalion from someplace too.
What about your instruction at the Armor School and then later here at Camp Chaffee? Did some of your instructional notes, lecture notes, and things like that, did any of that stuff survive?
No.
Okay.
Not a thing.
Well, what happens next? In fact, why don't let's stop a moment and tell me a little bit about General Greene in terms of your impressions of him, either at this point or later on. But
Yeah.
could you tell us a little bit about the man?
Yeah. Well, he was certainly not a young man. He had a solid gray hair. He's from an Army family. As I mentioned earlier, he could remember General Custer. Colonel Custer, when Custer went through Fort Leavenworth when he was a boy, and his father was at Fort Leavenworth. So he was no kid, but he was an exceedingly good general in terms of being able to delegate the work to somebody and not picking all the time. The outstanding thing I remember about General Greene, I think, was that as a signal officer in any of those organizations, you're always responsible for the public address system. So when anything happened that the general had to speak, or any high-ranking officer had to speak, they'd call the signal officer and say, please get the public address system geared up for this event, would you? And so you did it. So the day that the division was activated, which was just about my first acquaintance with General Greene, I was told off to get the public address system ready, which I did. And I'll tell you, public address systems in those days were notoriously unreliable and liable to break down, and and people would be just mortified because they'd have somebody up there ready to speak, and nothing happened, you know, and that was not infrequent. And I was determined that wasn't going to happen to me on any of these occasions, so I usually had the thing tested out well ahead of time, maybe the day before, and then that morning, or whatever. So I was ready. I was ready at the day we activated the division, and the general's ready to go, and I said, now, General, if you'll speak 12 inches from the microphone, I'll do the rest. And in an ordinary voice, just speak in an ordinary voice about 12 inches from this microphone, and we'll be all right. And so, okay, that I'll do. And the first thing he said was, when he got up there, every soldier in the last row, please stand up. They all stood up, praise God. So, and he didn't shout. I mean, he just said that in ordinary voice. I think that was the first time he checked up on me and got the right answer. But those things are vivid, you know. Those are certainly important in a young officer's life, that he come off well when he's required to do a job like that. And then we had some other experiences that were very difficult that the general I thought, handled very well. There was a period when inspections were the big thing. People from higher headquarters would come, maybe with a whole team, to inspect. I remember once we were subjected to an inspection of vehicles by some higher headquarters vehicle team. Every unit had to go through, and I'm telling you, those vehicles were inspected for the most nitpicking deficiencies that you can possibly imagine. I mean, if the hinges on a half-track door were not properly lubricated with a drop of oil, bingo, you know. If the inspector could take off the radiator cap and put his finger down in the radiator and get dirt off the thing, that was a bad mark. And all kind of points of lubrication and a lot. I mean, it's understandable that maintenance of that kind has to be performed and should be performed right, and people should know how to do it and prove that they did it. But it can be carried too far, and I thought it was a personal crusade on somebody's part to crucify General Greene because they were going at it so hard. But I think we made out all right finally. But believe me, a lot of folks in that division worked day and night while that inspection was going on to be sure that that they were covering all the bases, and they did it in the usual Army style. Somebody talked to people that had already been inspected and found out what the deficiencies were, just made real sure that those deficiencies didn't show up in the next vehicles that went through the line. But I don't know what else to say about General Greene except that he delegated well. I think he was fair. I think he gave good, clear orders. And I was very sorry that he did not get to go overseas when we, as a group, were ordered to the 12th. Because after a couple of years of training came some orders to the 16th that General Greene and certain staff officers were relieved from the 16th and assigned to corresponding jobs in the 12th here at Abilene. And those were difficult times for us because the reason that we were assigned is that some people had been relieved. And we had really no notion of why. We were outsiders. And we felt like outsiders too, you know, until we really got into combat and got going.
What about could you remember which individuals in terms of names or positions that came with you to the 12th?
It's in the file, and you have a copy of the telegram. I'm not sure that I can remember now. I think the G2, Symrowski, 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 came. I think Colonel Gordon, the Chief of Staff, came. I think Paul Holtz, that's H-O-L-Z, was in that group. And one of the combat commanders, I guess, Colonel Bromley, I think he was from the 16th, although he might have been in the 12th to begin with. I'm not sure on that point.
plus General Green.
Plus General Green, of course. And we were just ordered to move by air immediately from Camp Chaffee to Camp Barkley and take over, wham. And almost simultaneously, the division was getting ready to be entrained to go to port of embarkation. So I had practically no time. As I told you earlier, until today, I had never been in the city of Abilene. We landed at the airport, went to Camp Barkley, and a few days later, the train was backed onto the track at the camp, and we went aboard there, and from there to port of embarkation at New York.
What did you find at Camp Barkley? What kind of reception did you get?
Well, it's really hard to say. I don't think in general that we were welcomed by any means, but I didn't get a very much hostile reaction either, except in one or two individuals. As it turned out, the assistant division signal officer, a gentleman by the name of Luke McGraw, thought that he should have been moved into the position as signal officer, and when he wasn't, he was unhappy enough about that, so that when we got to Europe, he talked to the personnel people and said that he'd rather not serve under my command. And so he was relieved and was given a job at European Theater headquarters in Paris. Pretty nice detail, I guess. But the people in my own little signal office were just fine. In particular, I had a tech sergeant by the name of Benjamin Nicholas, who was really one of the finest people that ever worked for me in any capacity, civilian or military, because the details involved in the signal office on a day-to-day basis were really numerous and painful, and they had to be accomplished. I have told you in a write-up that you have that that the signal office had to publish daily a document called Signal Operation Instructions, SOI. Now the SOI had to include all the variables of the signal function for the whole division. By that I mean this: radio call signs. For security reasons, radio call signs had to be changed. Every single radio call sign in the division had to be changed every 24 hours. Then all the cipher settings that were in use in the division had to be re-indexed every 24 hours. And we had a simple cipher system, a little mechanical contraption, about 6 inches square, which operated sort of like a small typewriter to type out a simple cipher for use in lower elements, not nearly as sophisticated as the electronic machines that we use to communicate to higher units. Well, now let's see. I don't know where I go from there.
What about other personnel that
Uh,
made impressions on you?
yeah. Well, aside from Ben Nicholas, I had a group of officers and the assistant signal officer who got transferred. So we made the captain, the company commander, the assistant division signal officer, and picked another lieutenant to be company commander. So there was a little shuffling going on there, but that worked out all right. That worked out fine. The man who succeeded McGraw as assistant division signal officer was Bill Cure, C-U-R-E, and he worked with me very nicely for the rest of the combat period.
What do you remember, if anything, hearing anything about the relief of General Carlos Brewer, whom General Greene relieved?
No, no, I don't. The word was that for some reason or other, the 12th had failed their maneuvers, their final preparation for overseas movement maneuvers, and that was the cause of the shuffle. Whether or not there's the slightest truth to that, I have no way of knowing. No.
What do you remember about the entraining and the trip back to Camp Shanks and the voyage over? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I was in the advanced detachment, and we went, I think, to a camp on Long Island called Fort Hamilton. And we were only there a couple of days before we were assigned to the Ile-de-France, which had been converted as a troop ship. And we went over as an individual ship. The Ile-de-France traveled at high speed all by itself, and the voyage was uneventful.
Well, what about the rest of the division? Did they travel with you to New York, or was the advanced detachment separate and traveled alone?
It was separate. It was separate, and the rest of the division traveled in a set of different trains at different times, and as far as I know, perhaps from different places. I don't know that they all embarked from New York Harbor. But I do know that we were the first division that was supposed to land as a complete division at Le Havre. And it just didn't work. Either it was decided while we were en route that Le Havre wasn't well enough repaired to handle the division, or there was talk of the fact that, well, not the fact, but there was talk that there had been such a severe storm that the convoys had been all messed up and landed at a lot of different ports in England other than their original destination. However that was, I don't know. What I do know is that the advanced detachment landed at Greenock in Scotland and rode the train that night all the way down to Southampton. We were put aboard an LCI and transported over to Omaha Beach and dropped off at the beach with just what we could carry, and walked up the beach and into the hedgerows and set up an advanced detachment camp in the hedgerows. But we were only there a few days before it was realized that the division was scattered all over England for whatever reason and had to be regrouped someplace. The someplace was determined to be Tidworth Barracks, and we were ordered back then from France back to Tidworth Barracks, where all the units were being reconstituted into a division. And I'm sure that that our original division vehicles and tanks were all scattered around, because we were so busy assigning new tanks and the new radio equipment. You see, the division signal office had, or the company had, a radio repair section. But that section worked closely with the Ordnance Maintenance Battalion in equipping the tanks and all the radio equipment of the division. And this is not a simple matter, because the basic tank radio had a few channels so that a tank commander could communicate with the other members of his platoon and to his platoon commander and maybe the company commander, and that's all. The next higher echelon, the platoon commanders, had to be able to certainly communicate with their platoon and the company commander, maybe the battalion commander. So on up the line of tank equipment required for the different levels of command. And that meant that the radio people had to coordinate with whoever were setting up the tanks for the various units in such a fashion that the right radio got in the right tank, or the right pair of radios got in the right tank. In tanks like company commanders and battalion commanders, sometimes there had to be two radios in a tank, so that the commander in that tank could monitor two different channels at the same time. So at any rate, during those early days, the radio and the Ordnance Maintenance Battalion people worked very closely to get equipped and issued and get us all ready to get overseas, which occurred then in, I guess we were at Tidworth Barracks probably, I guess it maybe was a month. The dates are all in the record as to when we actually landed at Le Havre, and then went to not Falcomont, but went to a staging area near Le Havre. Name I don't remember right at the moment.
What happens once you recross? In fact, why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Once the division now makes ready to cross the channel, sort of talk us through that and those early days of December when you begin to go into combat.
Well, it was a busy time, for sure, and I don't remember too much about it. And the reason is that we no sooner got ourselves off this second trip across the channel than the general said, and by this time I was working for General Roderick Allen, who had relieved General Greene. General Allen got permission for me to go up and visit with the signal officer of the 2nd Armored Division, which was in the line in Holland, up the other side of the Roer Dams. And so I took off with my driver in a Jeep, and drove across Belgium up through the places that were later so famous, Bastogne, and up in that country, to get up to near the Roer Dams by Jülich and Düren, where the combat was at the moment. And I spent some time there with the Corps. I forget which Corps, 19th, I think, the 19th Corps, where I had some friends, and then in the 2nd Armored headquarters, kind of getting oriented to how they did business, and then driving back. And by the time I got back, the division units were ready to get on the road and start moving up toward Nancy, as we say Nancy, but that's not quite the right pronunciation for the Frenchmen. But anyway, we got on the road. It was a pretty uneventful motor march. We got ourselves installed at Nancy, and then moved up into the line. The exact day I don't remember, but we got shelled that first night we were in there. We thought it was personally directed at us, but actually it was only directed at the crossroads. The German gunners always gave important crossroads a little fire during the night, just to keep the truck drivers alive, you know, and keep them on their toes. But we took it personally, and we moved the headquarters out of the vicinity of that crossroad.
You mentioned that General Allen relieved General Greene. Could you describe the circumstances which that happened?
Well, as I told you, General Greene was sent from the 12th Armored Division to from the 16th to the 12th to take over the 12th, and then got on one of the trains. He was not with us in the advanced detachment, but he got to the port at some other time, and found when he arrived at the port of New York that he had been appointed commandant at the infantry school at Fort Benning and was not to go overseas. And when we got overseas, we got acquainted with General Allen, who had been appointed to take his place, which was a blow for General Greene. I know that he was not a young man by any means, and I know that the high command probably felt that he was just too old for the job. Who knows? He was no older than George Patton, and just as vigorous, I thought. And but anyway, General Allen was who he had to work with, and we certainly had no trouble with him. Colonel Barnes was chief of staff for him. I think each general not only was entitled, but as a matter of custom, was able to name their own chief of staff, you know. And Colonel Barnes and General Allen were good friends, and our relationship was fine.
What, as you enter combat, could you tell us a little bit about your operations? What you did in the signal company, and related to maybe take us up to Herlesheim, or any of those details?
Well, it's just a case of of making everything work all the time, you know. Uh, as I told you in connection with the 3rd Division, it seemed important at that time that there be good wire communication with between commanders. I think it was very important because the American commanders of that time, as well as this time, grew up from childhood practically with a handset in their hand, talking on the telephone. And the business executives as well as the military executives literally had grown up with the telephone and were most comfortable with the telephone as opposed to either voice radio or writing messages, which had to be coded and sent and decoded and delivered, etc. So I wanted to emphasize good telephone communication. So I did the same thing we had done in the 3rd Infantry Division. I reorganized the wire teams so that we had a wire team at each of the combat commands, Combat Command A, Combat Command B, and Combat Command R, the reserve command. And each one of those wire teams was assigned to start laying wire back toward the division headquarters as soon as that commander of that unit had decided that he was going to stop for as long as 6 hours. He was going to be there 6 hours or more, lay wire. And at division headquarters, we had similar teams working with each combat command so that we started laying wire toward the combat command at the same time that the combat command team started coming toward division headquarters. Well, this resulted in getting a wire net operating in good time and gave usually what it amounted to was that it permitted the commanders to be able to talk, verbal communication, person to person, all night. And this was not only good for the tactical commanders, but this was good for the administrative commanders too, because the logistics were absolutely fabulous in World War II. I mean, Corps had no responsibilities for logistics. The responsibilities for logistics were Army entirely. And all Army wanted to know was where on a map, where did we need the next load of ammunition, petrol, and food. And so every night the G4, the supply man, would be talking to his counterpart at Army and telling them what our requirements were going to be and where the dump should be. And lo and behold, you know, there it would be. I mean, it was absolutely well conducted, very efficiently conducted. But it depended on communication. And that was why I really worked on getting good telephone communication established as fast as I could. Now, I told you about the problem of the wire getting torn up by tank treads. Of course, anytime you have wire on the ground laid in the traditional fashion in the Signal Corps of just throwing it in the ditch and letting her go, well, that's certainly all right with foot soldiers, or it's all right with vehicles with rubber treads. But track vehicles under those circumstances just wrap up the wire and tear it all to pieces. So that's that. So as a solution, we developed a technique of putting the wire in the trees along the road. Well, practically every road in Europe has at least one row of trees on one side, if not two, and these are in most cases quite orderly rows. So we developed a technique of mounting one of the wire laying team on a platform on the top of the cab of the wire truck and having him pike pole the wire off the reel into the tree as the vehicle went down the road. Now, don't misunderstand me about the speed of this operation. This has to be done very, very slowly, actually, in terms of ordinary road speeds. You can't be moving over a couple of miles an hour, say. You're just crawling along, and it seems like it's going to be too slow. But as a matter of fact, you don't have very many miles to cover, and the big virtue is that the tanks can't tear it up, and it's used to stay in communication all night until we abandoned it in the morning. And of course, doing it that way, you sure use a lot of wire. In maneuver situations, before the war, we used to have to recover all that wire and resplice it and rewind it on reels and save it. And so the expenditure of wire, of new wire that we used to put down every day with no thought of picking it up was really staggering. But that's the name of the game, and the results were worth it. Of course, that wire was recovered by units later that came along in the rear, but the combat units didn't have to do it. Well, what else can I tell you about that? The radio people operated really no differently than they did on maneuvers. They were assigned, each staff officer of the headquarters was assigned a half-track vehicle and a radio operator, driver, so on. So that when we were on the march, that staff officer could communicate either by voice radio, short range, the FM, the same as in the tanks. He had one of those. Or he had a higher powered radio, which was radio telegraph, and an operator to operate it, so that he could send messages in code, or he could communicate in voice to certain nets himself if he wanted to. And the signal company had the responsibility for maintaining all of those equipments for the staff. We operated a message center. The message center in the Army is the post office. We operated regular mounted messenger runs to all the units. All anybody had to do to send maps or confirmation orders or written material of any kind was put it in an envelope and put the address on it and give it to the message center, and off it went. So we had Jeep-mounted messengers that were going night and day on regular message runs to all the units. Then we had a section known as telephone and telegraph that were the equivalent of the switchboard in the old Bell Telephone Company, where the girls put in the plugs to make the connections, and we did exactly the same thing in the Army. In those days, the switchboards were manual, The telephones were manual. The telephones were magneto-operated. That is, to place a call, you had to turn a crank. And behind the crank in the case was a magneto which put out a pretty husky shock. And that was enough to trip a little magnet at the switchboard, even if the switchboard were miles away. It would trip that little magnet, and a little lid would fall down, which would indicate that a call had come in on that line, in which case the operator would flip up the lid and then put the plug in and ask for the number and make the connection. So that was, and the teletype operator worked on the telephone lines with his teletype machine. By that I mean that we had a separate connection for the teletype. The cryptographic section handled the messages from higher headquarters down to us on the big cipher machines. We had two large cipher machines mounted in trucks. Well, they're 2.5-ton trucks with a house body in the truck bed, you know, and those cipher machines were for use with for messages to Corps and Army or the higher headquarters. They were under guard at all times. They were very very security conscious of the machine ciphers.
Could you tell us how those machines worked?
Well, they were similar in appearance to a teletype. That is, they had the typewriter keys, but inside the machine were rotating discs which had electrical contacts which were in each disc were 26 contacts on the surface of the disc, and those were electrically interconnected from one side to the other, so that there were some random connections possible. In addition to that, those discs were rotated each time a letter was touched. The disc moved one time on the first wheel, and then I suppose after that wheel had moved all the way around, the next wheel moved once, and so on down the line, pinball machine fashion, and I'm not just sure of the sequence. But at any rate, the security of the system was that that the connections, the electrical connections, were so random that it was very difficult at the state of the art being what it was at World War II. The difficulty of decrypting those messages was astronomically impossible, you know.
What other forms of encoding were used in combat? Any?
Yes, that a small cipher device, which I think I mentioned, about so square. I think it was called a M130. It was a little push button device, and at this stage of the game, I can't remember the principle that it operated on. I think it was a substitution cipher of some kind, and maybe it was on the rotating disc. The old the old cipher that the Army used up to World War II consisted of discs that were placed on a spindle. Each disc had the alphabet on it, and you had a whole array of discs on the spindle. When you want and there was a lining bar which came from one end of the device, so that when you slipped a lot of discs on the spindle, you could read along the bar. The bar gave you the alignment to read a group of letters. So that the procedure to use this particular kind of a device was to put the discs on in a certain order, and then move each individual disc until you got, say, a plain language message, a plain language group of letters that you wanted to send along the spindle, along the bar, along the guide bar, and then move the guide bar to another location and transmit from that other location the random letters that came up at that point. And then the receiving operator had to do the correspondingly opposite procedure. He had to mount the discs in the prescribed sequence, because each disc was different and numbered, and it just didn't have plain A, B, C, D, E around it. It had random array of the alphabet around each disc. So mount the discs, turn each disc so that a letter of the message appeared at the guide, and when you got all the letters of the message as you received it at the guide, you could then look around the disc until you found some clean language, which was pretty cumbersome. That was, and I think the M130 machine was a mechanical variation of this substitution cipher. And that was what was used for all the division units.
What do you remember most about the combat period? What stands out most in your mind?
Well, to me, Colmar did, really. I don't know whether you've heard much about Colmar or not, but there was a pocket, the last pocket in France, the last German pocket in France was at Colmar. And we were assigned to push it out in company with the 2nd French Armored Division. And so the forces duly converged on Colmar and closed up the pocket and shoved the Germans back across the Rhine. Fine. But this meant that an awful large number of troops had converged on Colmar. And the road logistics being what they were, somebody had to decide how to get all these troops back out someplace else instead of being all bunched up in there, and this took some time. The road network was not extensive, and each unit was assigned a certain time and a certain road that they could use to make a movement. And it so happened that our division and our particular headquarters was about 3 days down the list. And so we were stuck in Colmar. And the thing that made it so memorable was that across the Rhine in the Black Forest, in a tunnel on the railroad, the Germans had the biggest gun that I ever saw, and I have seen one up at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. I saw not that identical one, but a sister ship, so to speak, exactly the same gun that was captured in another location. And this gun was had a caliber of about 38 centimeters, and could throw a shell about 25 miles. And so every night at dark, they would roll that gun out of the tunnel and start shelling the town every 7 minutes by the clock. Every 7 minutes, another round would come in. And of course, at that distance, there was no such thing as real accuracy. There was a lot of spread to the impact area. It was longer from front to rear than it was sideways, but nevertheless there was this elliptical pattern of shells coming in to the town of Colmar. And when one of those shells hit a house, that was the end of the house and everybody in it. I mean, it was total destruction. And so for 3 nights, I think it was 3 nights, I'm not sure, but one night would have been bad enough, but it was more than one. We had to stay in town and just wait it out. And I tell you, this is very hard on the nerves when you're sitting down in the basement, looking at the clock, waiting for the next one to come in, and wondering whether you're going to get it right on the nose or not. And so that was a very hair-raising experience. And the other thing that made Colmar so memorable was that, as I said, we were kind of brigaded with the French 2nd Armored Division, which were African troops, Gooms. I don't know whether that's a tribal name or maybe it's a pejorative term. I don't know, but that's what we called them, was Gooms. And they could steal anything. We had to issue an order that the drivers were absolutely not to leave their vehicles unless they were in a guarded parking lot of our own guard around. Other than that, they had to stay with the vehicle and keep their weapon with them. The climax came when the Gooms stole the cryptographic truck of another division. Now, the Army regulation about the security of cryptographic equipment in the field says that equipment like that has to be under armed guard 24 hours a day, all the time, and that shooting is not only permissible but required if there's any problem. Well, that truck was stolen without a shot being fired, and that played havoc with the communication system because that truck had the equipment and the system papers for the whole theater. So that meant that the whole cryptographic system of the European theater was compromised. Well, you couldn't move around Colmar without some MP wanting to see the engine number of the car, of your truck, for a couple of days. They finally found the cryptographic truck in the river. The Gooms finally realized that they had something that was too hot to hang on to, so they shoved it into the river, and they recovered it. And of course, the cryptographic safes were all right. They hadn't been opened. But so the only permanent damage that was done, I'm sure, was done to everybody in the connected with the operation, the signal officer and the cryptographic officer, and God knows, maybe all the way up to the division commander. But there were a lot of people scalded for that operation. So I remember Colmar very much for two things. Now, Herlesheim was different in the sense that the advanced CP was, as I remember it, in a schoolhouse at Brumath. And we had the wire communication to Herlesheim and the other combat command locations. And I remember that in the middle of the night, all the wire communication shut down, and we had to go out and find out why, which is very unpleasant when we had only maybe a limited number of people available to do this. We didn't, since it was advanced detachment, we only had one wire team probably, and a few soldiers of one sort or another, switchboard operators or whatever. And so we all went out and patrolled that wire to find a break. And what had happened, of course, was that a German patrol had come across and cut the whole thing and balled it all up. And of course, that was no trouble after we found it to repair it. But the sticky part is to know in the blackout whether the patrol was still in the weeds there waiting for you to come along so they could shoot you down. Well, that didn't happen. We got that fixed. And so the combat part of the signal company in that operation was pretty comic. You know, it wasn't serious at all.
What about the troops going into Herlesheim? There was a large loss of life and captured and all of that.
Oh, yeah.
How did you find out about this? Did this have an impact on communications? Was that the first indicator something was going wrong?
Yeah. Yes, it was. The first thing that happened was that the general couldn't contact any of the tanks on his radio, and he couldn't hear them on his radio. I think the telephone line into combat command in Herlesheim worked all the time. I don't think they were out except for that one night when the patrol cut the wire. But he asked me, the general asked me to find out whether there was any problem, what the problem was that he couldn't raise those tanks. And of course we had people out close enough so that had anybody been on those channels, we could easily have talked to them, and we couldn't raise anybody.
How long was it before you found out what happened?
I just don't remember. Just a matter of hours, very few hours. There is a book on this subject by a man who was there. It's called The Other Side of Time. And the author of the book, as I recall it, was a medical man who was in that combat command headquarters and was there all the time. I was in and out of that combat command. He said it says in his book he never saw anybody from division, so I thought maybe I ought to write him a letter and tell him I was there, but I never did. That would be a good book for you to have. I mentioned the name of that to Dora, too, so she could put it in her notes, and I think you could either order that book or get it from the library. If you can't, I've got a copy. You'd be welcome to.
Several men who have been interviewed have mentioned the point in time in combat where the division was attached to General Patton's Third Army and left Patch's Seventh Army for the push to the Rhine, and have described their operations as intense and non-stop. Do you remember anything about those days?
Well, the thing is, it didn't make any difference to the operation. Yes, we were pushing. We were going 25 miles a day, maybe bang, 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 bang. But whose army we were working for just depended on the way headquarters moved those army boundaries from day to day. One day we'd be in the 6th Army, and the next day we'd be in the 3rd. And the change was, in my opinion, the change was meaningless to us. No doubt they had good reasons for moving the boundaries back and forth depending on the troops available and how they wanted the line or the lines of advance or the paths of advance to be strengthened or weakened here or there. But I don't think, in my judgment, it didn't make any difference to us who we were working for. We were told an objective every day. We were given boundaries every day in our orders. You know, go here, wham, push.
I've noticed in looking at the 12th Armored Division organization and division headquarters, for example, there were men that were assigned to signal operations duties. There were wire teams and such. Then you have the 152nd Signal Company. What was the organizational relationship between the company and these men that were in divisional headquarters? Did your company provide those men? Were they a part of the 152nd as well? How did that work?
All the communication personnel in the division headquarters were members of the 152nd. Now, each staff office had its own clerks and sergeants that, you know, that operated. For example, the G2 had some tech sergeants that operated the intelligence map, and the G3 had some clerks that operated the operations map. So each staff section had its own enlisted personnel, but they had nothing to do with operating the communication equipment.
So technically, when you look at the 12th Armored Division history books, they have a section in there, I believe, on division headquarters. I may be wrong about that, but I think they do. And there are some men, some group pictures that are labeled division headquarters, the wire team, or whatever the labels were. I don't recall. These were actually 152nd personnel that had been doled out for specific duties within the division.
Yeah, that's right.
One other question I might have as well, many of the men interviewed so far have indicated that as time went on and they got closer to the end of the war, huge numbers of German POWs became a problem for them, to the point where they weren't even disarming them but sending them to the rear. Did this have an impact on your operations? Did you encounter this problem? Did any of your personnel have any contact with German POWs.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. And I did too. Every place we went, we set up a signal office. I only had a portable desk about the size of that TV with a fold down front and a few materials in it. But I always had a phone and a desk at which I could work. And so I was in one day in a railroad station. I forget where. And lo and behold, in through the door comes this German officer, and I wasn't good enough on German insignia to know what his rank was, but he was in full uniform and everything, and walked up to the desk and gave me a big salute, and said he wanted to surrender. And not only that, he wanted to surrender, and he wanted to know when we were all going to war against the Russians.
What'd you do with him?
I sent him to the MPs. I had no time to be fooling around with prisoners, so I sent him off. He wanted to surrender. He was no menace, but so I had somebody take him. Somebody take him to the MPs.
What about some of the materials that you've donated to the 12th Armored Historical Collection? You brought some things in today. Remember the circumstances around which you acquired those?
No, not specifically. We, as we went through Germany, well, but let me back up. In France, since the French were our allies, we couldn't go into a little French town and tell people to get out. We were taking it over. We had to go see the mayor and find out what we could have and where we could billet people, if we could, any place. Now, they were really quite cooperative about it. After all, we were helping to get rid of the Germans out of their country, but they were pretty gruff people. But in Germany, 60 Minuten raus mit, which meant in 60 minutes get out of here. And we would take over a whole block in a German town and make it secure by a patrol so that we didn't get shot in our own beds or something, and set up division headquarters in a group of houses like that. And in those houses, some of those were left in, they were just left the way things were. The whole bookcases full, shelves full of books and household articles of all kinds. And so we just moved in and moved out. And in some of those places, I remember, I'm pretty sure it was in Dinkelsbühl, I think, that I had a house assigned to me which had been the home of a German subordinate political leader, a Gauleiter of some description, because the house was loaded with all kinds of propaganda material. And so I'm sure some of what I gave the school came from that particular place, and then others too. I mean, some of those nice colored postcards that were made into a book came from similar places. I just don't remember the details of place, but they were all from German civilian houses, all except Willy Messerschmitt's road map, which I took right off his desk.
Tell us about that chateau. Can you describe it? What do you remember about it? And where was this located?
Well, it was located on the road to Murnau in Austria, which is very close to Oberammergau. And it was just a big old house. It wasn't anything very fancy. It was. It had been built and formerly owned by Isidore Loeb, Loeb, of New York, and had been confiscated by the German government because half the things in that house had the monogram IL on them. So Messerschmitt didn't either build or own it. He just took it over since it had been owned by a Jew. And so it was just a typical big stone German house. There was nothing spectacular about that place at all. It wasn't a real high-powered chateau or anything like that. It was just a house, kind of out in the country.
Was it being used as a home, or was it an office area?
Well, I do believe it was a home, because when we arrived, we eradicated Willie's wife and also his mistress.
What do you mean eradicated?
Told him to get out. So I think he was living there too.
But he was long gone?
He was long gone, yes sir. He got away.
The little stereo card book, do you remember how you came by that?
No, I don't. It was in one of those houses, and I thought it was really quite an interesting piece of propaganda, so I latched onto it.
What do you remember about the waning days of the war? Could you sort of talk us down through Heidenheim when you settle into occupation duties?
Well, the big thing of it was all toward as the war wound down. It was the big moves every day, where we went so many miles from headquarters to headquarters, and the nice thing about it was that at that time the Army was getting more sophisticated in its communication facilities, and we had attached to us from Corps a microwave unit. Now you see, as I mentioned in some of the correspondence to you, the responsibility for communication in the American Army is down. The superior unit is required to be able to communicate with its next subordinate unit, and not vice versa. It is not the responsibility of some guy way to hell and gone out there to communicate with headquarters. Headquarters has to communicate with him. And I mentioned, I think, that some of your people would be interested in studying the Second Battle of the Marne in the First World War, because that's the thing that caused that doctrine to be formulated, that the German armies became echeloned one with each other because they got so far away from their headquarters that communication broke down, and the two armies did not realize that they were so badly echeloned, and that's when they had that famous taxicab march of reserve troops come out from Paris. The famous taxicab march from Paris came out there and got in that opening and enfiladed, and it was a rout. The Second Battle of the Marne was a disaster, and it was a communication disaster. And consequently, the responsibility in our Army then and now is that the superior headquarters communicate with the subordinate headquarters. Now, to carry out that function during most of the war, Corps laid down for us what was known as Spiral 4. And Spiral 4 was a cord about the size of that one going to that camera, about that big around, in a heavy, heavy rubber casing with 4 wires in it. And that could be mounted in such a way to keep it out of the treads of the tanks. It could be sort of semi-permanently mounted. And with those 4 wires, you could get any number of combinations of circuits so that we got telephone and talking circuits and everything over the Spiral 4. But when we were moving so fast, like 25 miles a day and so on, that really became difficult. And so we were fortunate to have these microwave trucks come along, which are very much like the trucks that you see the radio stations have equipped for their remote broadcasts. The TV stations now, today, have those remote little panel trucks, you know, with a little pop-up antenna, and that's what these men had. They had quite a tall tower, which was a portable, extendable tower for their dish, and they could get that tower up and get the dish aimed back to headquarters. And immediately, as soon as our headquarters, division headquarters was set up, they could be in business, and off of that one beam going back to Corps, they would have 4 talking channels and 2 teletype channels available right now, just like that. And that's just marvelous for us, and good technical feat.
What else perhaps you haven't covered that you might like to add for the combat period? Anything?
Well, oh, we were strafed and we were shelled, but we didn't suffer any casualties. Just a few wounded, really. I don't think we had anybody killed in the 152nd. We were in an anomalous position in that we were combat troops, but we were technical troops first, really. And because we were in an armored division, we all had, I had a ring mount with a .50 caliber gun in it, and we were all armed to the teeth with carbines and pistols and everything else, but we never really got into combat. We weren't combat troops. I mean, we were armed in case we broke through in some situation where people try to close us out, you know. But aside from being strafed, which is an unforgettable experience, and bombed, and having that long-distance artillery on us, those were the bad experiences of combat as far as we were concerned.
Any good times associated with that?
Oh, yeah. I have to think a minute now to get my place names correct. Deidesheim, D-E-I-D-E-S-H-E-I-M, H-E-I-M. I don't know whether it's Diedesheim or Deidesheim. I'm not sure. But that town is on the Rhine plain, just near where we crossed the Rhine, not far from Worm. And the nice thing about that town when we arrived was that the GIs found that the limestone caves under the town were absolutely packed with wine. There was wine, beautiful, beautiful white wine, forever in these caves, which had already, some of it in kegs and tons, and some of it bottled, ready to go, you know. And so that was my introduction to really good white wine. I had never tasted anything like that before, but I sure had white wine with my lunch around Diedesheim, I'll tell you. And I've had some since. I've had some in this country. We had a case that we were able to buy that I saw in the liquor store within the last few years, and I got it and remembered how good it was. But then the other thing was that people were always running into liquor caches like that. And I've got a bottle at home that I'm sure is a collector's item. Gosh, maybe that should go to the museum. Because I should have brought that, you know. Because I'm sure it's valuable, but you know it's only valuable if you know the right market for it and you have some idea of what its value is. And I don't know the market, and I have no idea the value. But the bottle is unique and important because it's got a regular label on it, Cointreau, and the bottle's empty, incidentally, now. But it was a Cointreau bottle, a brown, square Cointreau bottle. But overprinted on the label, it says in French and German, but not English, French and German, property of the Wehrmacht, not to be sold on the market. Well, I'm telling you, that opens the floodgates for every GI in the United States Army, because everything that was Wehrmacht was booty, and you were entitled to it. And so I'm sure that not much of that survived, but I saved that bottle. I thought that would be a good keepsake with that. Well, I used to be a stamp collector, and stamp collectors see things like this. They see strange imprints in places where there are not supposed to be any imprints, you know, and consequently, that's a historic item. I tell you, I'll make you a deal. When you come over for crabs next summer, I'll give you that bottle.
Okay. As long as it's empty.
As long as it's empty. Yeah, you don't have to sample it.
Did you have any contact, do you have any memory of contact with French civilian personnel or Germans, other than what you've already mentioned about housing your personnel?
Yeah, well, the outstanding thing that you notice going through France in a combat situation is the fact that there aren't any young men around. They've all gone. They were in the Army, and a lot of them didn't survive the First World War, let alone the Second. And so the men that you meet are grandfather types, mostly. and the women are running the place and doing the job, and they've got more guts than anybody in this whole world. That's the impression you get. They just wouldn't be run out of there. You know, we would be assigned someplace where we could share quarters, and we could, by pidgin French, and some of them could speak some English. We'd be talking about what it was like when the Germans came through and what they did. Well, we go down in the cave, go down in the basement. Well, don't you know that they clean out the town by throwing hand grenades in the basement? Oh, yeah, we know. Well, why don't you leave? Oh, no, we're not going to leave. No, down in the cave. Boy. Yeah, they were strong. They were strong people.
What about the Germans in comparison?
Well, I really have no idea. I just have no idea. There was a big order about non-fraternization. We were ordered that we could not fraternize even if we had occasion to fraternize with anybody, young, old, or in between. And so I don't think I ever talked to a German civilian of any kind except the employees of the Post and Telegraph. The railroads and the post office and the telegraph are all run by the same administration in Germany. That's why we often had our division signal office, at least in the railroad station, because it was also the telephone and telegraph, and as a perk of that job, the manager of that whole enterprise had quarters up over the railroad station. That was his house, his personal living quarters, for the family. And so often we would, and this was true after the war. I'm talking now after VE Day, when we occupied Heidenheim, and we were establishing telephone contact with the other units around. We would say to the guy, well, through an interpreter, we had some German-speaking fellows, we'd say, well, we need 10 circuits to ohm. Jawohl. We need so many circuits to someplace else. Jawohl. You know, they were amazing. I mean, they knew who the boss was, and my impression was that's all they wanted to know was who's the boss, and the boss gives the orders, and I can just imagine the reverse circumstances where somebody would come into the switchboard, some German who had overrun the country, came into the switchboard in Abilene and tried to get somebody to give him 10 circuits to Fort Worth. You know, it'd be, I don't know, me know nothing, me no speak of the language, you know. But in Germany, jawohl, anything you want, we got. And, it was striking. It was very striking that they are so obedient.
I don't want to end this before asking you a little bit about your impressions of General Allen. We haven't talked about him very much.
Well, we had a good relationship. We got along all right. He seemed to be quite a reserved gentleman. And I saw him kind of on a daily basis, but and very informally, but I don't recall he ever gave me an order, and the only time that I ever approached him, I would say formally, was on one of these marches where we were making many miles a day, and the headquarters commandant located the headquarters. Now, the headquarters commandant was supposed to locate the headquarters in conjunction with the signal office. And why he put this headquarters down in the bottom of a sharp valley, I don't know, but he did. And consequently, for us to make our radios work, we had to remote control those radios clear up to a hill someplace, because the radios were blocked by being in the valley. And we had a terrible time getting things organized down in that valley. And I had to go to the general, and I said, "General, you know, we can't operate like this. Here's the situation. We're down here. We've had to run the radio trucks clear up on the hill in order to make them work, and have a remote control wire come down to the handset down here and so forth. And I certainly need to be in consultation, in closer consultation with the headquarters commandant about the location of the headquarters with respect to signal communication than we ever got into in this situation." And he listened to my story, and I guess he agreed with me, because it never happened again. But he didn't make any big issue about it one way or the other. He accepted the fact that we needed different circumstance, and I just didn't have a whole lot of direct necessity for communication with him. He was very kind to me in the matter of a decoration, but
What about the end of the war? What happens to you? Tell us a little bit about the end. Heidenheim, and how you finally get home and that kind of thing.
oh, well, yeah, I was in Heidenheim for maybe a month, but on about the 1st of July, I got another set of orders for strange orders, like I had in the signal company in the first place. And these ordered me to use air transportation immediately back to the States, and to report for duty at the Fort Leavenworth Command and General Staff School as an instructor, which I did. And I wasn't there very long, and I didn't teach very many classes before I had points enough. VJ Day came along, and right after VJ Day, if you had 120 points, and I forget how you calculated points, but they were based on number of months in service and months in combat and this and that and the other thing. I had more points than I needed, and so I requested that I be returned to civilian life, that I be an inactive reserve officer again.
And what did you do after the war?
Went back to General Electric Company. See, I was an assistant sales engineer when I was ordered in, so I was a sales engineer when I came back, and then I was assigned to a job in Rockford for a year, and then they asked me to go down to Peoria, Illinois, because the manager was going to retire down there, and I was to be office manager in Peoria, and then I was in Peoria for 7 years, and then they asked me to come to Chicago to be industrial district manager in Chicago, and I stayed there from 52 to 72. So I was there for 20 years and then retired.
Well, is there anything else that you'd like to add, looking back over the interview, that you did not have a chance to say or mention or discuss?
I had a chance to say everything I can think of.
Well, thank you, Mr. King, for this interview, and this concludes this tape.